Hey everyone, in this video I'm going to show you a tutorial for how to knit a one color brioche pattern hat. I had previously done a one color brioche stitch video and I demonstrated how to knit a scarf in that video, which is knit flat on just a regular needle. But to knit a hat in the round, the brioche pattern changes slightly, and I have examples here of two hats that I've knit up with the pattern. And they're both technically the one color pattern, but I've used two different colors just to add a little bit of design in here. So this one is a really simple one with just a couple lines, whereas this one I just kind of alternated the two colors into stripes. But at any given time we're only working with one color, so this is still a one color brioche knit stitch. And there is a slight difference between when you do the scarf, which is knit in the flat, versus when you do a brioche stitch when you're knitting in the round. So if you're new to knitting in the round, then this is a, I want to say, not so difficult pattern to follow. However, if you're absolutely unfamiliar with the brioche stitch, I would recommend going back to the one color brioche stitch pattern that I have a video on, and maybe take a look at that and familiarize yourself a little bit with that first. I've provided the link down below. But if you wanted to still go ahead and get started with the hat as your first brioche project, that's fine too. And I'm going to show you step by step how to make this hat. And I've provided the pattern for the hat down below as well. So for knitting a hat in the round, you're going to need a circular needle. And typically for hats, a circular needle, the best size for the circular needle is 16 inches. So the needle itself all the way around, if you stretch it out, would be 16 inches. Now, sometimes you may not have just a 16-inch needle. You might have longer circular needles like these that might be maybe 24 inches long, or 20 or 28 or 36 inches long. And that's fine too. If you have a longer than 16-inch circular needle, you can still knit in the round using a technique called the magic loop method, or the magic loop technique of knitting in the round. And I've provided a video link down below to a tutorial that shows you how to do the magic loop technique. And so that's one option. Or you can get the 16-inch needle, the size that you want, the circular needle, and use that. A third option is whatever needle that you're going to be using for the hat, you will also need a set of that same size of circular needle, but in double pointed needles. Because when you're knitting a circular hat, or when you're knitting a hat in the round, you kind of start the hat at the brim and keep going up, but eventually you start decreasing stitches so that you get the shape of the crown. And as you decrease stitches and you get to fewer and fewer stitches, especially if you're knitting with a 16-inch needle, you're going to eventually need to transfer it to double pointed needles and essentially have your stitches on 3 needles and just work them in the round that way. Now, some of you may actually prefer to work in the round entirely right from the start using the double pointed needles, and that's fine also. I prefer to knit with the circular needle first until I get to the point where I don't quite have enough stitches to be comfortable on the circular needle, at which point I switch to the double pointed needles. That being said, let me show you how to knit the brioche one color hat in the round. So the pattern below tells you exactly the number of stitches to cast on, and I've done the same thing here, and I've cast on 64 stitches in the round. Now I've used size 3 needles for this pattern, and I've used not so bulky yarn, but a decently thick yarn, and I've provided the brand of the yarn that I've used down below. So if your yarn is different than the one I'm using, and your needle size that you want to use is also different, that's fine too. You can adjust the number of stitches accordingly. What I would suggest is using the yarn and the needle size that you want. Make a small little swatch, maybe with 12 stitches or 14 stitches, or some. Actually, if you knit it in the flat, then you'll need an odd number of stitches, but just make a small little swatch to get a gauge. And once you have the gauge, then you can adjust the number of stitches accordingly. Typically for an adult hat, for the brim, you want about a 20 or 21 inch circumference of the hat. Okay, and I want a little bit of a tighter knit because the brioche is a the brioche stitch provides a very stretchy fabric, but I wanted the hat to have a little bit of a tighter sort of a beanie, fit more like a beanie, and so this is why I used a tiny needle, a size 3 needle, even though my yarn is decently thick, a worsted weight yarn. Okay. And so once you've cast on the number of stitches you want, in this case I have 64 stitches and I've cast them on using the long tail method. I've provided a link down below for that video in case you're not familiar with this technique. And once you've cast on the stitches, what you want to do is you want to have your end where the stitches you've just finished casting on the stitches here. And this is the starting end. Laid out like this with the stitches end facing on your right. And then just make sure that all the stitches are facing in the same direction and that your yarn is, or your needle is not twisted like this, okay? So make sure that the stitches are all facing inward like that, okay? And then you're ready to join and start knitting. Now, with hats or with knitting in the circular, whether it's hats or any other types of patterns that you're following, you typically want to put a marker at the point where you're joining the two of them together to go knitting in the round. And the reason is because that just kind of helps you identify where your row ends so that you know to begin the next row of the pattern. And markers, there's lots of different types of markers. I typically use these little plastic rings. You can also use these little stitch markers, or there's lots of different fancy markers. So whichever one works for you, just go ahead and slip a marker at that point, okay? And now you're ready to join. So you're gonna pick it up and you're ready to insert here and start knitting. Now the brioche pattern, it's really one setup row that you do, which is your first row, and then you follow 2 rows and you just continue those 2 rows to the point where your hat has finished the bottom part of the hat, and now you're ready to shape the crown. So until that point, which is about 6.5 to maybe 7 inches long, you're pretty much doing those same 2 rows. Once you have your setup row done at the bottom, you're just doing those rows, okay? So let me show you how to do the setup row. So you'll notice in the setup row, the pattern tells you that your yarn needs to be forward, okay? So just bring your yarn in the front, and then you're going to insert your needle into the stitch on this side of the circular needle, and you're just going to slip the stitch. So you insert as if to purl and just slip it over. Now remember, your yarn is in the front. You've just slipped the first stitch. Now you're going to bring the yarn all the way over on the right needle, okay? And then you're going to purl the next stitch. And this very first row, your stitches may be a little bit, it helps to have cast on the stitches a little bit loose, and also it might feel a little bit tight as you're joining, so you may have to just keep adjusting your stitches a little bit to get them close enough to the 2 needle edges. But that's it. Now, as you can see, we have joined the work, okay? So let me show you that one more time. I'm going to just take this off. Okay, so we talked about keeping our stitches like this, making sure that they don't turn, right? That they're not twisted. Then you pick up your needles, insert your marker, and start knitting. So I'm going to bring the yarn forward. I'm going to insert the needle as if to purl and just slip. Then I'm going to take this yarn that's in the front, I'm going to loop him all the way around this right side part of the circular needle, and then I'm going to purl. And then your yarn is in the front already, so now you're going to slip, loop the yarn all the way around, and purl. And the whole row, that's all you're doing. Your yarn is already in the front. The first time you have to kind of manually bring the yarn to the front, but the rest of the time your yarn is already in the front, so you are just slipping looping the yarn around that right needle and then purling. Slip, loop the yarn around, purl. And so you're just going to keep doing this all the way around till you get to the last stitch on this side of the marker. So I'm going to go ahead and do that bit right now, and I will meet you guys when I've completed the loop, and I'll show you how to do row 1 and row 2. Okay, so I'm now at the point where I'm almost done with the setup row. I have about 4 stitches left, so I'm going to finish those up by slipping yarn over, purl, and then slip, yarn over, and purl. Okay, and that brings me to my marker. When you get to that point, just slip the marker over from the right side or left side to the right side. Okay, now in the second row, or rather in that first row, so this is the setup row, you're only doing this the one time at the start. Now for row 1, you'll notice that when you look at the stitches, you'll notice how stitches are paired up together like these two, and then there's a single stitch and a paired up stitch and a single stitch and a paired up stitch and a single stitch. And so those paired up stitches, we call them brioche stitches. And what we're going to do in this first row is every time we come to a brioche stitch, we're going to knit both of those stitches together, called a brioche knit or a bark. So at this point, your yarn is in the front. At the end of this setup row, you're going to take the yarn to the back, and you're going to insert the needle into both that first loop, which might be a little bit awkward when you're in this first one, and there might be a little bit of a gap, and that's okay. But you're going to insert your needle through both that stitch as well as that loop, and you're going to knit. And that's called a brioche knit, B-R-K, or bark. Okay, so you're going to bark that stitch, then you're going to bring the yarn forward. Just bring it forward, and you're going to slip the next stitch purlwise. And that's it. You're repeating the same thing all the way over. So the next stitch, as you can see, it's one of those double stitches, the brioche stitch. So we're going to knit it or bark it. We're going to bring the yarn forward. We're going to slip. And so throughout the row, that's all you're going to be doing is brioche knit, yarn forward, slip. Now notice that I'm not taking the yarn back to do the brioche knit. I'm letting the yarn stay in the front. You only take the yarn back at the very first brioche knit that you're doing. But after that, the yarn stays in the front when you do your brioche knit. So brioche knit, yarn forward, slip 1. Brioche knit, yarn forward, slip 1. And you're just going to keep repeating that throughout the rest of this row to finish the first row. So I'm going to do that, and then I'll meet you guys up to show you row 2. Okay, so I'm now at the point where I'm almost done with the setup row. I have about 4 stitches left, so I'm going to finish those up by slipping yarn over, purl, and then slip, yarn over, and purl. Okay, and that brings me to my marker. When you get to that point, just slip the marker over from the right side or left side to the right side. Okay, now in the second row, or rather in that first row, so this is the setup row, you're only doing this the one time at the start. Now for row 1, you'll notice that when you look at the stitches, you'll notice how stitches are paired up together like these two, and then there's a single stitch and a paired up stitch and a single stitch and a paired up stitch and a single stitch. And so those paired up stitches, we call them brioche stitches. And what we're going to do in this first row is every time we come to a brioche stitch, we're going to knit both of those stitches together, called a brioche knit or a bark. So at this point, your yarn is in the front. At the end of this setup row, you're going to take the yarn to the back, and you're going to insert the needle into both that first loop, which might be a little bit awkward when you're in this first one, and there might be a little bit of a gap, and that's okay. But you're going to insert your needle through both that stitch as well as that loop, and you're going to knit. And that's called a brioche knit, B-R-K, or bark. Okay, so you're going to bark that stitch, then you're going to bring the yarn forward. Just bring it forward, and you're going to slip the next stitch purlwise, and that's it. You're repeating the same thing all the way over. So the next stitch, as you can see, it's one of those double stitches, the brioche stitch. So we're going to knit it or bark it. We're going to bring the yarn forward, we're going to slip. And so throughout the row, that's all you're going to be doing is brioche knit, yarn forward, slip. Now notice that I'm not taking the yarn back to do the brioche knit. I'm letting the yarn stay in the front. You only take the yarn back at the very first brioche knit that you're doing. But after that, the yarn stays in the front when you do your brioche knit. So brioche knit, yarn forward, slip one. Brioche knit, yarn forward, slip one. And you're just going to keep repeating that throughout the rest of this row to finish the first row. So I'm going to do that, and then I'll meet you guys up to show you row 2. All right, so I have completed row 1 with just a few stitches left at the end. So I'm going to finish those up. So bark, yarn forward, slip, bark, yarn forward, and slip. So I've now just completed row 1, and now we're ready to begin row 2. So we're at the marker point, just bring the marker over, slip it over to the side. And now row 2, the pattern will tell you that make sure the yarn is, or bring the yarn forward. So we already have the yarn in the front at this point, so you can leave it there. You slip this next stitch, okay, slip as if to purl, and then bring the yarn all the way over, kind of like we did in that setup row. You're bringing the yarn, looping the yarn all the way over on the right needle, and then you have again the same thing, the 2 stitches, the single stitch, the 2 stitches, the single stitch. This time we're going to purl both of those stitches, what we call a brioche purl or a burp. Okay, so you're going to just insert your needle through both loops there and purl that stitch. All right, now your yarn is in the front, leave the yarn in the front, slip, and loop the yarn around and burp or brioche purl. And so for the second row, you're just doing the same thing, slipping, yarn over, brioche purl. Okay, slipping, yarn over, and brioche purl. And if you're not quite sure, I mean, it'll be pretty evident, but if not, just look at your stitches and you can clearly see the single stitches and the brioche stitches, those 2 stitches together. So when you're at a single stitch, you're slipping it, then you're bringing the yarn all the way over. And when you're at the brioche stitch, you're burping it, purling it together. Okay? And so you're going to keep doing that till you get to the end, and that's row 2. So then all you're doing is you're following row 1 or doing row 1 and row 2 until your work measures about 6.5 or 7 inches long. That's typically the height for most adult hats of the body of the hat. Now you can certainly make it a little bit longer if you want to, because then you can always fold the hat at the bottom once it's worn. Always better to have it a little bit longer than shorter, because if you have it shorter, then you're constantly tugging at it to fit over the ears. So just make sure it's the right height. I would say about 7 inches long is pretty safe, but again, a little bit longer, better than shorter. So you're just going to keep doing that until you get to that point. And at that point, then you're just going to follow the pattern for the shaping of the crown. Now, you'll get to a point, actually before I come to that, I just wanted to mention a couple points. In this brioche pattern, when we're doing the brioche stitch in the round, we do want an even number of stitches, not odd. If you go back to my 1 color brioche stitch pattern, you'll see that for the scarf, we had an odd number of stitches. And that's because we have sort of the knit stitch border on one side, whereas here, because we're knitting in the round, we don't need that extra stitch, so we have an even number of stitches. So if you do change up the stitches to match your yarn and your gauge that you're going to use for the needle that you want to use, just make sure that the stitches are an even number of stitches and the pattern will work. And so when you get to the point where you're ready to shape for the crown, I'm not going to go through the demonstration for that because it's very, very similar. Anytime it says a bark, you're just going to, if it says bark, then you're going to brioche knit or bark that stitch. But the point I wanted to make was you will come to a point where you actually have to knit stitches together, as in you're going to have to knit not just that brioche stitch, but also the stitch next to it together. You're going to have to sort of, and it'll only be on the rows that you're doing the knitting stitches. And so to do that, what you're going to do is you're going to pretty much insert your needle into all three of these stitches. Okay, so you're inserting your needle not just through the 2 loops of the brioche stitch, but you're inserting it through the single stitch as well. So you inserted it through all 3 stitches and you're going to knit them together. Okay, and by doing that, what you've done now is you've actually decreased a stitch. So with each row, as you're decreasing, with each alternate row, I should say, as you're decreasing, you'll notice that we're doing the decrease of those stitches by knitting not just the brioche stitch, but also the stitch next to it together. So if you follow the pattern along and do that, you'll get to the point where your crown will keep getting smaller and smaller, and you will get to a point where your stitches are just not, there's just not enough stitches to be comfortable on a needle. Now, if you're using the magic loop method, it may still be okay to continue on the needle, the circular needle, but if not, it really helps to transfer to double pointed needles. So you always want to make sure that your double pointed needles are the same size as your circular needle that you're using. And to transfer onto the double pointed needles, I'm just going to show you here. Obviously you'd pretty much want to do it when you're at the end of one row and you're ready to start the next row, preferably, but I'm just going to show you what you can do is you can just, you pretty much start knitting with this needle. So you're essentially, instead of knitting with this end of the circular needle, you're just going to start knitting with this needle. So I'm just going to bring the yarn forward, slip this yarn around. We're on row 2 right now, so brioche purl, slip, yarn around, brioche purl, and you'll just keep doing that. You'll knit up to a certain point onto this needle. Once you feel like you have about 1/3 of the stitches on this needle, then take your next needle and start knitting the rest of the stitches on there. Purl, slip, yarn over, brioche purl or burp, and so on. So you'll just keep doing that till you have the stitches divided evenly among 3 needles. You can certainly do it among 4 needles too, but I think 3 needles works. So you'll keep doing it till you have stitches with the 3rd needle onto 3 needles, and then you'll be using your 4th needle to knit around it. And so at that point, where it gets to the point where you just don't have enough stitches, transfer them over to the double pointed needles. And it varies for different people. Typically, if it gets to the point where your stitches are just not fitting around the needle and you're having to really stretch them, that's the time to transfer them to double pointed needles. And really that's it. If you follow the brioche pattern, when you get to the end, you'll only end up with about 6 stitches, at which point you're just gonna, it describes it in the pattern. I'm not demonstrating it here, but you'll just thread the needle and kind of pass the needle through the little loop, remaining 6 stitches in there, and just pull it in tight, and that kind of makes a nice little edge inside. And for this hat, I have put a little pom-pom at the end. You certainly don't need to. The pattern looks pretty nice at the top. You don't really need to hide anything by putting a pom-pom there. I think the pattern looks makes it look really nice at the top. And because it is a reversible stitch, really, you could, if you're just making it with a single color, you could flip the hat, wear it on the other side. Although with this one, because I've put these little lines, it's a little, I think it looks better on this side. And I still left my tail in here because I was debating if I want to put a pom-pom on this one or not. And I think maybe I won't. I'll leave it like this. And so when you're done, you just want to weave your ends in and your hat will be ready to use. I hope you've enjoyed watching this video, and if you have, please hit the like button. If you have any questions at all, or have questions about wearing the needle or the yarn or anything, please leave me a comment. Leave your question in the comment box and I will do my best to answer it. And if you have any suggestions for additional videos, please also leave that in the comments. And if you want to see more videos, please subscribe to my channel, Knittycat's Knits. Thanks for watching and happy knitting!